Welcome to the Modern Husbands podcast, where men share ideas to manage money, the home, and a life full of experiences with our partners. We're thrilled to host Jackie Cummings Koski today. Her story was just shared on the Rachel Ray Show, and today we're going to dive deeper into that story to understand how she was able to go from poverty to retire a millionaire at the age of 49. Jackie holds a Master of Science in Personal Financial Planning and Financial Therapy. She's the author of an award-winning book, Money Letters to My Daughter, and she's been recognized by the U.S. House of Representatives. Jackie, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, so we just saw your story on the Rachel Ray Show. Wow.
Yeah, how about that?
Can you share a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, it was kind of crazy. I think the funnest part to me was when one of the producers reached out to me, and I am not the best on social media. I barely check my DMs and things like that, but she DM'd me, and I think she might've sent me an email. Her name is Rebecca. And she said, well, we saw something else that you did, and we just really love the way that you explain things. And that's kind of my teacher at heart, right? I like to break things down and explain them. And she was telling me that they've always wanted a segment about investing and personal finance. And she wanted to create that segment with me. So it was just so funny because we were on the phone for like an hour the first time. And she's talking about her 401k and her finances, and we got her together. And before you knew it, this turned into a segment. And this was done several months ago. And I just appreciate working with some real pros because they coached the heck out of me in getting this segment together. So some of it was shot with a really good quality iPhone. And I'm like, wow, iPhones are that good. And I have an 11. So we did some shooting that way.
Really? They shot the Rachel Ray Show with an iPhone. Okay.
Some of it, yes. Some of it was with an iPhone, of course. And again, this was where traveling, the in-person stuff, and the whole COVID effect was still around. So they weren't doing things in person. So we had to improvise. And so that added a whole nother layer of complexity. But we did, I got them the footage they wanted. They wanted pictures. They gave me all these shooting tips. They recorded that piece. They put a package together. And then I had my big interview with Rachel. And they put graphics together. So they did all the magic. And I just appreciate them coaching me, showing me how the real pros do it. And I had such a fun time working with them. So I have to give them a lot of credit because it turned out a lot better than I thought, because with all the extra curveballs we were thrown, I didn't know how it was going to turn out. I hope that what I was explaining was coming across in a way that her audience could understand it, that it was fun and we're enjoying it. And they're just a fun group.
Okay, take us from the very beginning. So what started your passion for financial literacy and explaining these financial concepts in such an accessible way that you ended up on the Rachel Ray Show? And I know more to come. You're here on the Modern Husbands podcast, for example.
I'm on the Modern Husbands podcast.
That's right.
I think what really started me was probably at the time of my divorce. And that is a very trying time for anyone. It's emotionally draining. I had a daughter that was, I think at the time, 9 years old. My life was being turned upside down. And I grew up in poverty. So that whole poverty mindset, and I guess that reminder of how tough it was not having what you needed, it just kept playing in my mind. So I never wanted to be in poverty again. Didn't want my daughter to be in poverty. But when I got divorced, all these thoughts around poverty kept circling in my brain. And so after, I would say about 2 years after getting divorced, just getting myself okay, getting my head right, and really thinking about, okay, what next? That super hard question that, we hate to ask ourselves. But it led me to saying, I want to learn about money and personal finance. And one of the big differences, one of the big disparities that really got me going was the fact that when we looked at both of our retirement accounts, our 401k at work, we made about the same money. It wasn't like, I was a teacher and he was a doctor. but we made about the same money. And I had $20,000 in my 401k. And at the time, we're in our mid 30s, and he had $120,000. So he had $100,000 more than me. And I felt so financially ignorant. I felt just that I should have been doing better. And I was pretty hard on myself. So when I finally—
Why the disparity?
Well, I went back and I played detective, and there was a lot of little things. Okay. So some of them were that he had more aggressive investments in his 401k. This was around like 2003, 2004, 2005. And he worked for a very large bank, one of the top 3. And the bank stock was one of the options in his 401k. And at that time, bank stocks they were about one of the best asset classes you could be in. I think he might have been contributing a little bit more than me as his salary was increasing. You've got the gender wealth gap that I think was kind of taking effect where, I had a college degree. He didn't even have a college degree, but his salary was increasing faster than mine. So as your salary increase, if you're just doing the match or whatever, as a percentage, it goes up, right? So those were just a few of the things that I sort of recreated. And I think probably the biggest thing is that compound growth. So it was just a little bit in the beginning, but if you take a 10-year period, that gap is getting wider. So it was no one big thing, but over time that added up. And it made me feel just so bad about what I was doing with my finances. And at the time, I didn't even have an answer. So I had to decide that I just never wanted to feel that financially ignorant again. And that's when I decided I joined an investment club. That was one thing where I was talking to a friend. I live in Ohio. She lived in Boston. And we just happened to be talking about stocks. And she mentioned this organization, a nonprofit organization called Better Investing. And she said, they have investment clubs all over. Yeah. She goes, you could Google it. You probably have one in your area. And there was one in my area. And one of the big reasons I love being around these people, well, first was that it was community. And I liked being around people that was interested in the same thing that I was interested in. I was interested in the stock market. I was interested in how it worked. And that's what we talked about in these investment club meetings. I mean, we actually invested real money, just small amounts. Also, coming out of a divorce, it was really nice to not talk about the divorce, because at the time, it seems like every conversation began and ended with divorce. And I just was done talking about it. And it was refreshing. And it was so nice to just be around people that were interested in the same thing I was interested in. And so that was the first thing that really kind of helped me realize how important it was to get your money growing. Like, you can't save your way to wealth, the inflation is going to eat it up. So it made me feel more comfortable to invest in my 401k, to invest in my Roth IRA. I even started investing in my health savings account. And then I also invested in some individual companies because I'm the nerd that loves to do analysis on great companies, and I enjoyed being an owner. So after I started doing that and learning everything, the first thing I wanted to do was to share it with my daughter. And she was 14 at the time, not listening to much of what I was saying. So I decided to put it all in a book. I titled the book Money Letters to My Daughter. It was literally just these short little letters about different topics on money. And I feel like everyone has this book in them, or an audio file or video or something to sort of document the things that you learn and pass it on to your kid, your grandkid, or whoever that's coming behind you. It shouldn't get lost when we're gone, right? So when I wrote that book, I started doing financially literacy sessions like within some high school. Well, I started at her high school. And then I went to all the high schools in the district that I grew up in South Carolina. And it just kind of snowballed from there, because I got a lot of gratification and a lot of satisfaction from teaching what I had learned, particularly to people that might have came from the same type of circumstances that I did, because I grew up in poverty. I was on the free lunch program. I went to a Title I school. And so I'm seeing all these kids when I'm speaking, and I'm seeing myself. So it felt so good. So that's why I kept that going, because I was really enjoying making a difference, especially with people that might have started in the same way that I did.
You obviously are an inspiration, and I know you covered a lot there, but there was something that really stuck out for me, where I get super excited about this. I love talking about ways to shelter our investments from taxes. You brought up an HSA. So can you explain to our listeners what a health savings account is and the tax benefits?
Yes. Well, first of all, I will say that it's a horribly marketed tool and underutilized because of that. So those started back in 2004. So it's been a long, they've been around for quite some time. But I think the reason why they're just catching on is because there's 3 different industries that's involved with health savings accounts. You've got the banking industry, you've got the tax industry, the investment industry, right? It's a cross of all of those. When each of them are speaking about it, they're really talking about their little siloed part. The strategy is to take all 3 pieces and merge them together, right? So the basics of a health savings account is the big thing is that you must be on a qualified high deductible health plan, which goes to that horrible marketing. Who wants something that's high, right? So I like to call it either an HSA eligible plan or a high deductible, but a low premium plan, because typically the premiums are significantly lower. And I got to see that with my company. So as soon as my company started offering these health savings accounts, and I saw that you can invest in them, I was all about it. And luckily, me and my daughter were both very low consumers of healthcare. So even though I wasn't high income, I could cash flow, these health expenses because we were using so little. Most people, when you hear them talking about it, they'll mention the triple tax savings. So what that is really triple tax and a bonus. So the first benefit that you get from a health savings account is that it's pre-tax. So the money that you put in comes out of your taxable income, you get a tax break there. While it's growing inside the account, tax-free. And when you take it out for qualified health expenses, it's also tax-free. Now, the bonus is if you are employed and you get your contributions made through payroll, you don't pay FICA tax, and that's that Social Security, Medicare. Yeah. So that's the one that people miss, and that is 7.65%. So there's your discount already on top of the other 3. So just by doing that, you've already saved yourself a lot of money, especially depending on your tax bracket. So the second part is something that, I didn't really know in the very beginning, and a lot of people don't even know they could do this, but you can invest inside of your HSA. Now, the circumstances in which you would want to do that is if you're viewing this money for long term, because you only want to invest, especially in the stock market, when you have a longer time horizon. So if your goal is to deplete the account, every year, then that's different, but you don't have to. It rolls over from year after year after year. A flexible spending account, an FSA, people get that mixed up all the time. An FSA is use it or lose it. You cannot roll it over.
Awful. They're awful. I hate those.
Well, and they could be beneficial. And I guess, we're not talking about FSAs, but FSAs, remember, flexible spending account, it doesn't have the word medical in there anyway. So you can have a dependent FSA. You can have a commuter FSA. So there's some FSAs that you can actually have along with, a health savings account, but people get them mixed up. But an HSA, it rolls over from year to year. So that means you can invest it, which is what I did. My company's provider required I think $2,000 in cash. And that was to kind of cover any expenses that might happen because the deductible was a little bit higher. So once I started investing in the account, I kept it super simple. I think I invested in like an S&P 500 index fund. It was a Vanguard.
There you go.
Yeah, it's so simple. I'm not doing anything fancy in there. So compound growth totally took its effect. So since it was me and one other person, and that other person was my daughter, I was able to make the family contributions. So I did that it was 2008 until I retired from my corporate job in 2009.
Wow.
So count the years. How many? 11 years, 12 years, guys, something like that. But anyway, the maximum contribution for the family, I want to say, was always between like maybe $6,000 and $7,000, something like that during this 10-year period. Invested in an S&P 500 index fund. The last few months excluded, the high water mark for that account was $160,000. And so now I can use that as part of my long-term strategy. And I have a bucket that exclusively is there to take care of my healthcare, because the guarantee is that my healthcare expenses are going to be much greater in the future than they have been in the past. And you can use it for things like, Medicare premiums, any out of pocket. So even though like today, I'm not even on a high deductible health plan, I can't make any new contributions, but the HSA that I have, it's still growing and I can use it for out of pocket. So that's something I consider one of my superpowers because of the tax efficiency, investing in, and knowing so many things that I can still use it for tax-free.
This podcast is brought to you by Modern Husbands. We are a community of devoted husbands of working spouses who share ideas to manage money, the house, and a life full of experiences. Visit modernhusbands.com to learn more. I love that story, and I'm getting excited just thinking about it, because that leads me into the next question. There's so much about the FIRE movement that I love, and I have to say I grew up in a house where my father wouldn't say, he doesn't know what the FIRE movement means, but he is that. He embodies much of that. So I would love for you to explain to the listeners that, first of all, you're 49 and retired, and you are a member of the FIRE movement. Can you explain like what the FIRE movement is and how you went about using those strategies to retire at the age of 49?
Yes. Well, I do love the FIRE movement, and I definitely consider myself a part of the FIRE movement. So I retired in 2019, and I was 49 at the time, as you mentioned. Now, 5 years prior to that, I would tell you that you're crazy, right? Because we're all conditioned to think that the typical retirement age is 65 or 70 or something like that. Social Security considers early retirement at 62. Some of these retirement accounts you can't get to until 59 and a half. So when I started finally realizing that I don't have to go by what someone else is defining as early retirement, and I started probably reading some blog. Well, you know what? I'm a podcast listener. So more than anything, I probably started listening to some podcasts. And back in, I would say 2008, there were almost no personal finance podcasts. Like it was the three main guys. It was Dave Ramsey, Clark Howard. There was some Money Guy show. I remember I would listen to that too. Okay. So fast forward to about 2013, 14, after my daughter had graduated from high school, I'm doing a search in my podcast player, and there's a ton that comes up. And then it wasn't just the personal finance umbrella. It was niches. It was real estate. It was financial independence, then retire early. So I'm like, that's what I'm interested in. So I'm listening to this. And at the time, most of them were, that avatar they say for all the fired people, white male engineer, highly paid and all that. And you know what? That's probably how it started. But I have always been able to learn from almost anyone. So I knew my life and my situation wasn't identical to them, but I could take what they were talking about and I could adjust it for my world and my lifestyle. So as I was doing that, I had to make a lot of tweaks around the corner, but the big thing was figuring out where I was at. And that was through like my net worth, what's called a FIRE number, which is 25 times your expenses. Just a very easy way to do it, to kind of figure out what your number is to be able to remove that obstacle of money and to do whatever you want to do. That's the big overarching thing. Like, what is your why? And I learned that figuring out what your why is, it gives you more energy. It gives you more excitement to work towards that. So it doesn't feel like such a grind, because when I hear people talking about minimalism and scarcity and all of that, I'm like, that's not the goal there. That's not the goal. I mean, if that's your superpower, then go for it, right? Nothing wrong with minimalism. But if I thought that that's what I needed to do to get to my goal, I wouldn't have done it. So once I figured out my why, which was financial literacy and education, I just found ways to be able to get to that goal. So overall, in terms of the FIRE movement, basically they are thinking a little bit different. They're saying, I don't think I have to wait till I turn 60 to retire. I don't have to be tied to my job. I can sort of supercharge my savings efforts. I mean, some of these people are have a savings rate of 30%, 40%, 50%. Mine was probably right around 40. I was pretty good at saving, so that part wasn't hard for me. But for some people, that might be more of a challenge. Well, maybe they will do something different that they love. Some people might love real estate, so they decide to make more money. Maybe they're in a field, they're an engineer, right? And they can make more money. So there's a lot of different approaches, but the whole overarching goal is to increase sort of the gap between what you're making and what you spend. If you think about it, our parents, they told us this: don't spend everything that you earn.
Yeah.
Always invest something,
Right.
So it's really an old concept, guys. It's really an old concept that has a great new name now, and it's called the FIRE movement. But these are like a lot of the things that they were talking about wasn't brand new, but it did put it into context, and it put it into today's world. And with the technology and information being available instantly, you can learn about anything you want. That makes the difference. So if you are able to increase your savings rate, like whatever you make, you're able to save more of it, then you are living off a smaller amount, and which means that you need less when you're ready to retire. And for me, I thought, honestly, the earliest I thought I could retire was like 55, because I knew about that rule where if you leave a company at 55, you can get to your 401k. And when I started looking at, only after starting to look at some of these numbers, so you really do have to know where you are and where you're starting. Even if you're in the red when you do your first net worth statement or you're working towards your FIRE number, it's okay, but you got to know where you're starting. So when I started pulling all these accounts together, old employer 401k, pulled together my HSA, pulled together my Roth, it was so cool to see all these accounts together. And then that net worth was way better than I thought it was. And then I created, I'm a spreadsheet nerd. So I created this spreadsheet where I would put together all the dollars that I was saving, like 401k, Roth, HSA, and each year I would color code it, put in there each year about how much I would end up investing, how much that would grow, and came up with a reasonable time frame of when I would reach my number. I spend about $40,000 a year. I'm in Ohio, low cost of living area. Housing is reasonable and so forth. Yeah. So I was living off about 40,000, and I'm not even the best budgeter. I figured that out by looking at what I was saving and what was left over, right? So after figuring out what that number was and doing year by year what I was contributing and seeing how that FIRE number, that net worth grew, I knew about when I could retire. And I was actually able to walk away if I wanted to when I was 47. And I decided to work a couple more years. Luckily, I liked my job. I liked my boss. I liked who I worked with. So I wasn't running away from work. And, I still kind of had that poverty mindset or that fear of being in poverty again. So I wanted to make sure I had a really big cushion. So I worked about 2 more years before I actually, pulled the trigger and retired early.
But you can still work at any time, but you just have the freedom to know I don't ever have to work.
Yeah, and I still do projects and I still do projects and things like that. Like financial literacy will always be in my heart. Like I'll never retire from that. I'll be on my deathbed, and my daughter will like try to get me to remember something because I probably have dementia at this point, and I'll be saying, "Oh yeah, go check the stock market," or "How's that Apple stock?" I'll be saying something like that. But I am still doing. I will always do projects, even when I was working full time. I would do financial literacy classes, workshops, and have all these different projects. So I was playing double duty for probably the last 5 years that I worked. So I would do things on the weekend, in the evenings, and things like that. And even now, like certain things just break my heart. So I had someone reach out to me from a county, a very large county in the South, and they ran a program for people that were sort of fixing themselves after DUI. And he was getting a DUI. He was saying that they could use some financial literacy. And he says, everybody that I've tried to reach out to, when I tell them the group that they'll be working with, they don't want to do it. And that broke my heart. I'm like, that's crazy. That's crazy. We've all been down on our luck. We all need this financial education. And so I said, I'm really sorry that, you've had such a tough time. So, I'm going to do something to work with them, but it's just little things like that. One day, one of these guys will be, somebody that's making a difference in this world. And this is a moment that maybe they just need a little extra help. So I feel like there's so many things in this world that could be helped from just a little financial education, even if you're just removing it, because I see money a lot of times as an obstacle that's keeping you from getting to what you really want to do or getting to your goals.
Right.
So if you're able to remove that obstacle, because I remember growing up, it would ring in my head again and again, we don't have enough money for that. I don't have the money. I got to wait till I get paid and all those things. So it's just, to me, almost like a magical thing to not have to worry so much about that financial part when I'm going for my goals or going to do something I want to do. So just removing that obstacle, and that biggest obstacle tends to be money, from doing, keeping us from doing the things that we really want to do.
So it's so refreshing to hear about the FIRE movement from someone who has, been through fire. There was an article a couple of weeks ago that came out from this young man talking about how everybody ought to just save more and get on this fire journey. And then you lift the hood on this guy, and he's 21. He's got a $200,000+ salary from working at his father's hedge fund. Immediately your eyes roll, and somebody, you tune out at that point, right? Because it's like, how does this person have any credibility? But you do, and so it's just been really wonderful to hear strategies from you, and also the fact that you are far more mature than I, and you can hear a story like that and still pull lessons from it that you can use on your own journey. It's just so cool and inspiring to hear from you. So thank you, Jackie. Any last takeaway that you would leave for Modern Husband podcast listeners? One kernel to finish our show here.
One of my biggest things is that no matter where you're at, nothing is permanent. I think the reason why financial literacy means so much to me is because it really changed my world as, a little Black girl growing up in poverty. Because like you said, the FIRE movement, you've got a lot of people that's all of a sudden an expert on it, and it's just this buzzword. And I'm thinking, if this is exposed to more people, and we've got more voices, then even someone that's growing up in the worst of circumstances could move the needle. I'm not saying that they would be able to retire at 49. Maybe they don't even want to retire, but to kind of know that wherever you're starting, figure out where you're at and where you want to be, and just move toward that direction. You don't have to change the world in a day, right? Just make some, like for a lot of what I did, it was just a compounding of it. It wasn't one magical thing that I did. I didn't have any superpowers, until I got going, and then it compounded, and then it started feeling like a superpower. So I just think that it's possible for anyone to move the needle in the right direction, and just don't give up, because I know a lot of people feel like, hey, I started in these, growing up, in poverty, or even worse. There's a lot of things that's worse than that. So I've learned that my situation is not the worst that there is, but there's growth. And then when you've got people watching you, namely your kids, like my daughter, she's obviously of a different generation. She's in her 20s, but she got to see mom retire early. She was my biggest cheerleader. And she was the one that got to see all the behind the scenes. She knew it didn't happen overnight. And now she could never even imagine working till she's even 50. She's already an entrepreneur and working a corporate job and figuring her money out. So I feel good that I kind of changed the narrative that's different than how I grew up. So there's always, progress and ways to move the needle. That's what I just like to see. And, we all have influence over plenty of people in our circle, not even just kids, but there's other younger people, a younger generation that's looking at you, watching you. And even if they pick up one little thing, you could possibly have an impact on them.
Well, I know you've influenced our listeners, and you're the real deal. And I And I know that you're somebody who, when our listeners hear this, they're going to be motivated to use some of these strategies to be able to build wealth for themselves, to attain financial freedom earlier in life. So they're healthier, they're happier. And you can subscribe to our newsletter. You can visit us at modernhusband.com. So it's modernhusbands.com. And we share these types of strategies and ideas to live a life full of happiness with your spouse and a life full of experiences. And of course, at modernhusbands.com, it's where you can download our podcast and subscribe for future podcasts. Jackie, cannot thank you enough for joining today.
Oh, guys, this was so much fun. Thank you for having me.
A big thanks from Dr. Ross, Christian, and myself to today's guest, and of course, our listeners. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe to today's podcast. You can find our podcast on modernhusbands.com or anywhere you download your podcasts.